Hey there, everybody. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to the Honorable Mentions. At the conclusion here of our month-long series, the 30 most important albums in the history of hard rock and heavy metal. It's been a wild ride. Lots of classic stuff we talked about that filled up the 30 days of November, 30 albums, some really great ones. Of course, like I mentioned multiple times during the month, 30 slots, literally hundreds and hundreds of albums that could have been considered. You can't fit everything in that you want to. So I wanted to pick out at least, I got around a dozen or so honorable mentions that were kind of floated around as I was formulating my list, and ones that didn't quite make the list of 30. But I did want to mention, because I think they're all pretty important, and I think each one of them has meant a great deal to, hard rock and heavy metal history. Certainly big influences on so many other bands, and influences on us, the fans, as well, right? Because that's what it all comes down to. So I'm going to kind of go in order of when they came out. I'm going to start off one really early. This one, again, could have been on my list, probably should have been on my list, but I think the fact that they're getting a mention now, and this album is getting a mention now, it just goes to justify how great this band was, and how, to me, fantastic this album is. I could have picked any one of their early albums, especially their classic albums. Got to go with Alice Cooper, Killer, 1971. There were some people who kind of, took offense that I picked Kiss over Alice. Could go either way. If I picked Alice instead of Kiss, or, then it's the same thing, right? So, and it just came down to space. But I do want to mention this album. Could have picked Love It to Death, could have picked Billion Dollar Babies. I mean, so many great albums here. Alice and the band, so important. The whole kind of shock value, the macabre value, right? Mixed up with, really good pop-infused hard rock, but definitely important for the theatricality of hard rock music, right? But man, classic songs on here: Under My Wheels, Be My Lover, Halo of Flies, Desperado, You Drive Me Nervous, Yeah, 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 Dead Babies, and Killer. I love, what I always loved about Alice Cooper is the mix of the more serious, kind of ominous and creepy material with the more lighthearted, upbeat, just good party anthem rock and roll, right? Great band, great frontman, great album. Killer is killer. How about these guys? Another British band that found a way to mix the grandiosity of classical music and Broadway style bombasticness with good, especially early on, good crunchy heavy rock music. You had a frontman who was flamboyant, who could sing like an opera star when he wanted to. You had a guitar player who still to this day has one of the most unique styles in all of rock history. He could come up with some amazing riffs. He could solo with the best of them. You had an amazing bass player, also a really good writer, and a dynamic drummer who was also a good songwriter and singer in his own right. Of course, I'm talking about Queen. I decided to go with Sheer Heart Attack. Bum, 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 bum. I mean, great stuff on here. Really great stuff on here. You could arguably go with the first two albums. I almost went with Night at the Opera. You could go with Day at the Races. There's so many Queen albums from the 70s that you could pick from. I decided to go with this, kind of like a midway point. I think there is material on this album that also really influenced a lot of the 80s heavy rockers and metal bands and thrash bands, right? You got Brighton Rock on here. You got the great single, kind of quirky Killer Queen, Tenement Funster, Flick of the Wrist, great hard rocker, Lily of the Valley, Now I'm Here, great anthemic hard rock song, In the Lap of the Gods. How about Stone Cold Crazy? I mean, it's got to get a mention just for Stone Cold Crazy, man. Just an amazing, amazing early kind of speed metal song. Dear Friends, Misfire, Bring Back that Leroy Brown. Queen, take any of their first album. I almost went with the first album, but first album, the band still wasn't kind of hitting the stride. That's probably their heaviest album. Queen 2 is heavy and proggy. Then you got this one. I mean, they really kind of put it all together with Night at the Opera. I almost went with that one, but I decided to go with Sheer Heart Attack. Pick any of them. Let's go later on in the decade, right, as the 70s are kind of making their way. How about Lights Out by UFO. Proof that you could have a gritty, heavy rock, hard rock, whatever you want to call them, band, and have lots of great melodies and have a kick-ass Herculean lead guitar player at the center of all of it. I mean, Michael Schenker and the guys in UFO, the meaning of the two, they took what was arguably a relatively obscure kind of space rock, blues rock band, and all of a sudden you throw Michael Schenker into the mix, a German guitar player, and these band of Brits all of a sudden become this amazing hard rock machine that cranked out one album after another during Schenker's time with the band, and came up with some classic songs. Too Hot to Handle, Just Another Suicide, the great ballad Try Me, the killer title track Lights Out, Getting Ready, Alone Again, Electric Phase, the amazing Love to Love. Just, again, here you could have really metallic, bluesy, heavy rock songs with this just lightning fast, virtuoso, tasty melodic lead guitarist. How many times have we seen that in bands going forward, right? Exactly. All right, also right around the same time, one of the great debuts in all of hard rock history, all of rock history, proof that you could have a top of the line production matched up with radio friendly songs, with killer guitar riffs, killer solos, an amazing vocalist, where every song is built for the radio, but every song just kicks ass. I'm talking about the first album from Boston. Okay. I mean, one of my favorite albums of all time. I've heard it a million times, and I'm probably going to listen to it a million more times on the rest of my days on this earth. More Than a Feeling, Peace of Mind, Foreplay, Long Time, rock and roll band, Smokin', Hitch a Ride, Something About You, and Let Me Take You Home Tonight. It's familiar, it's melodic, it's kick-ass, one of the great hard rock records of all time. All right, as we move into the 80s, sometimes classic bands have a split, and it doesn't work out that great for either one of them. In this instance, I think both factions needed a break from each other, and both made out really well. In this instance, it's the lead singer, Ozzy Osbourne, leaves Black Sabbath, goes and starts his own thing. Blizzard of Oz, I like Diary better, but this is the album that really, I think, put Ozzy on the map as a solo artist, and it's got Mr. Crowley and Crazy Train and all those other great songs, right, which are iconic Ozzy songs, and of course it's got Randy Rhoads, of course that really young hotshot guitar player who probably would have been the next great thing had he not died so young, a year and a half after this came out in that tragic airplane accident. So Ozzy, Blizzard of Oz, so iconic, so influential. Speaking of influential, here we got a guitar hero that basically spawned a generation of guitar players who wanted to play just like him, doing neoclassical shredding at the speed of light. Ingva Malmsteen's Rising Force, his first solo record. There's the man himself. Most of us first heard Ingva on the first Alcatraz album, No Parole from Rock and Roll, and that really got the ball rolling. But then once he came out with this and jump-started his solo career, I mean, the 80s were, you either were in a band playing guitar, doing the style of Van Halen, or you were in a band playing guitar, doing the style of Ingve. That was the 80s, right? So you had one and the other. You had all the kind of power and progressive metal bands doing the neoclassical shredding. You had all the more kind of hard rock, glammy type stuff, the LA kind of thing of Van Halen. But yeah, Ingve and his band Rising Force, got to be on this list. Speaking about European stuff, how about power metal, right? Power metal has become, a real juggernaut. Maybe not in mainstream album sales, but if you look at overall, among people who are into heavy metal, a lot of power metal bands, a lot of very popular power metal bands. Do any of them really get to where they are today if it wasn't for the influence of Germany's Helloween, Walls of Jericho? I don't know. You could arguably say that Iron Maiden kind of paved the way for this, and Rainbow and a few other bands before them. But Helloween and this album is really what helped give us bands like, Gamma Ray and Hammerfall and Primal Fear, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Killer stuff. Call it speed metal, call it power metal, whatever you like. So many great tracks on here, man. Victim of Fate, Walls of Jericho, Ride the Sky, Starlight, Murderer, How Many Tears, Heavy Metal is the Law. Of course, this CD reissue contains both the EP and the Walls of Jericho album. I always kind of lump them together because they came from right around the same time. So many great songs. It's classic stuff right there. You can't not have this series and not even mention this band at least once. I decided to save them for the honorable mentions. Slayer, Rain and Blood. 29 minutes of just absolutely unbridled fury and precision. So many thrash bands, so many extreme metal bands kind of took this formula and ran with it. This is Slayer at their most ferocious. Rick Rubin producing them. This is an unbelievable sounding album. As brief of it as it is just so pummeling. This is Take No Prisoners, thrash metal at its very best. Yeah. Angel of Death, Altar of Sacrifice, Jesus Saves, Postmortem, Raining Blood. Classic. All right, as we move into... before we move, we got to stop off in the late 80s, 1987, I believe. Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction. Like I said, I did have them originally on the list. I took them out. Basically, again, everybody knows I'm not a fan, all right? But I remember I was even listening when that first album came out. Basically, to me, they became the band that we always hoped that Aerosmith would continue on as. And for me, when Aerosmith started to become a hit-making machine and moved away from their raunchy American hard rock sound, Guns N' Roses were there and basically said, okay, you don't want to do it, Steve and Joe and the boys, we're right here. We're young, we're hungry, we want to be rock stars, and they delivered a stunning debut album, which is still considered by many people to be a classic to this day, and regardless of what myself thinks of the rest of their catalog, that debut is still very, very important. It sold a gazillion copies. So many bands wanted to be like Guns N' Roses after that. They were kind of like the last vestiges of the 80s, of that whole kind of really popular hard rock and commercial metal and glam metal scene, right? And they continued on becoming popular into the 90s. They were one of the few kind of hard rock acts, holdovers from the 80s, that was able to sustain, although briefly, due to the band themselves kind of imploding from within, moving into the 90s and, still selling lots of records, at least for a few years and a few albums before, long periods of inactivity. And, of course, Slash and a few other members broke away and did other things. They've come back together in recent years to do some tours, but we still have not seen a new album from them. And I don't know, will we ever? I don't know. Quite frankly, Guns N' Roses could probably continue being a unit and just playing live for the next decade, playing 80% of that first album and a couple other selections from some of the, Use Your Illusions and whatever, and they'll be just fine, right? So, because that's mostly what people want to hear. So, Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction. We're going to move into the 90s. How about the band Death, Human? They had already been around for a few years before they released this in 1991 with their very, very early death metal style. Here, they decide to inject a healthy dose of complex prog and fusion into their just absolutely pulverizing death metal style, the birth of progressive death metal or progressive extreme metal. Perhaps Death were an extremely important band throughout the 90s, doing that very intricate style of death metal that had just, blistering guitar solos, very jazz fusion-y guitar solos, amazingly intricate drumming, crushing riffs, and really well thought out songs. I mean, you got Flattening of Emotions, Cosmic Sea, Vacant Planets, Suicide Machine, Secret Face, all sorts of great songs on here. Again, not my favorite Death album, but this is the one that really kind of jump-started a whole other subgenre of extreme metal. technical or progressive death metal. All right, another one I'm not a fan of, but hey, you can't ignore the importance. And again, this is kind of like, I wouldn't say it's off the beaten path, but, in the early 90s, we had all of a sudden this style of music coming from Seattle that was, eventually called grunge, right? Grunge really was just a kind of offshoot of like 70s and early 80s style heavy rock and bits of punk and hardcore, right? So, of course, talking about Nirvana's Nevermind, released in 1991, was a absolute game changer. I mean, it jump-started the whole Seattle revolution. Before you know it, you had Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, and all these other bands, Pearl Jam, right? Then you had, from different areas, you had Stone Temple Pilots and all this other stuff that was kind of coming up. But Nirvana, the whole thing of just bunch of guys wearing flannel and jeans with cheap guitars and, just singing about how depressed we all are and all that kind of stuff, making lots of noise, but making it heavy. And don't need guitar solos, just need some cool riffs and some, vocals that the young kid or lyrics that the young kids can kind of relate to. And Nevermind sold millions of copies. And before you know it, bands were popping out of the woodwork from Seattle and all over the world, trying to play music, simple music, but heavy music like that. Again, owing a lot to the greats of yesteryear, but with a different attitude, totally different attitude. You know what? All the hairspray and all the glitz and glamour and the 80s metal scene were the antithesis of that. That's what the grunge scene was all about. Okay, and Nirvana, and especially Nevermind, was the kind of gateway to all that. All right, so we're going to fast forward about a decade, all right? Another one of those bands that I think were trailblazers in kind of allowing folk and 70s style progressive rock to infiltrate extreme metal, specifically death metal, where you could have nuances and melodies interspersed and weaving around this just demonic juggernaut that was, what their core was all about at the time. I'm talking about 2001's Blackwater Park from Opeth, the album that really put them on the map. They were already starting to make waves before, but this is long considered their classic. It's easily a top 2 or 3 favorite of mine from Opeth. At times I've called this my favorite. At times I've called it my number 2 or 3. It's definitely in the running depending on my mood. But, The Leper Affinity, Bleak, Harvest, Drapery Falls, Dirge for November, The Funeral Portrait, Patterns in the Ivy, the massive title track. Again, just inhuman growling death metal vocals mixed with gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous, clean melodic vocals, crushing death metal riffs, intricate acoustic guitars, very folky guitars, proggy guitars, loads of atmosphere, amazing drumming and bass playing, little bits of keyboards here and there. I mean, just, again, how many bands copied Opeth going forward? Many. And last but not least, from the same year, a band that kind of took bits from the 90s, kind of like alternative rock scene, but did it in a way where they injected, bits of kind of like space rock and progressive rock and just absolute weirdness, but with plenty of attitude. They had amazing musicians. I mean, really intricate guitars and bass and drums, and a vocalist who was very, very different. He had a way with conveying emotion that was very unique still to this day. I'm talking about Tool. My pick is Lateralis. Could pick any of the Tool albums, really. A band that, still to this day, people are trying to figure out exactly what they are all about, right? They don't record that often. We see a new Tool album every, half decade or so. Sometimes it's more than that. All the albums are kind of shrouded in mystery, always with weird album covers and, and lyrics and things. They don't tour all that often either. It's this kind of like weird mix of, like I said, 90s alternative and King Crimson and all sorts of other things thrown into the mix. A very, very cool band, a very, very different type of metal band. And again, I think the influence of Tool has been felt all throughout heavy music over the last 25 or so years. And they're my final pick, my final honorable mention of this series. So thanks everybody for watching. 30 days, the 30 most important albums in the history of hard rock and metal, and about a dozen honorable mentions. So thanks for watching. I am Pete Pardo. It's been an absolute pleasure bringing this to you this month. This was hopefully as much fun for me as it has been for you, or hopefully it was as much fun for you to watch as it was for me to do. That's what I meant to say. It's early, folks. It's early. So again, thanks for watching, and tune in for December for another monthly topic, and as well as we move into 2022 January, we're going to be doing another albums that turned 50 years old in 2022. So we're going to be drawing from 1972. So that should be a wild ride as well. So each day you'll get a different favorite of mine from 1972. So that's coming up starting January 1st. So stay tuned for that. I am Pete Pardo. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already and click on that notification bell. We've got the link below to our merch page if you want to get some Sea of Tranquility swag just in time for the holidays. We've also got the link to our Ko-Fi page for channel donations and the link to seaoftranquility.org, our webzine that is celebrating 20 years, 20th anniversary this year. Thanks for watching. Once again, I am Pete Pardo. Have a good one, and thanks for tuning in all month. I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.